Lebbeus Hordern's great-grandparents, Anthony and Anne, arrived in Australia in 1823. They set up a business in Sydney, which was already quite a wealthy little town of about 12,000 people. From the beginning, they showed amazing initiative. This advertisement was the first in Australia to include a picture. 3 generations later, Anthony Hordern's was one of the great department stores of the world and the biggest in Australia. As well as having this huge emporium, they also had a wonderful mail order business. Virtually Australia's answer to Amazon at the time. They had over 4,000 staff. In 1909, Samuel Hordern II, then the principal owner, died, and his estate was worth nearly £3 million. He decreed that it should be shared among his children. The boys got far more than the girls, but they were supposed to work in the firm. The oldest son was Samuel Hordern III, typical of the Hordern family, hard-working, looked after his employees, deeply religious, abstemious, thrifty. Lebbeus was a younger brother. He is aged 18 in 1909, so his income was held in trust till he was 21, maybe $70,000 a year. And then he started spending. He married the beautiful 20-year-old Olga Moni in a wedding of extreme opulence, and the two of them settled down to be at the top of the A-list of contemporary society. He had to have somewhere to live, and this is his country cottage, his weekend at Barrel, and he had other large properties throughout the state. This is his city house, on 2.5 acres of land in the King's Cross area. He had to have the fastest racehorses, the most luxurious yacht, the fastest motorboats, the fastest cars. And he bought his cars largely from Jules Maillard, the agent for Brassier cars. Maillard was actually in touch with the Farman Aircraft Company, so through him, Lebbeus bought a Farman seaplane, which arrived in the middle of 1914. And as you can see, it created a huge sensation. This is the famous photograph of it taken by Society photographer Sam Hood. Lebbeus made one outstandingly good decision. He got the visiting French pilot Maurice Guillot to assemble and test the aeroplane. And Maurice was a very skillful technician, and the aeroplane flew very well indeed with no problems at all. Many important people were taken for a ride in Lebbeus's aeroplane. They're especially politicians and military leaders, and quite a number of beautiful women, actually. Maurice Guillot declared his intention of staying in Australia forever, and he and Lebbeus were planning to go into the aviation business in quite a big way. Lebbeus himself learned to fly. One of his sisters pronounced judgment on this process. She said, by all means go for a ride in Lebbeus' aeroplane, but don't let Lebbeus fly it. He's too dangerous. Nevertheless, this story appeared in the Herald explaining how he had to learn to fly with great success. Unfortunately, he didn't have much time to enjoy his aeroplane because the war broke out. Guillaume went back to France, and Lebbeus presented his aeroplane to the Commonwealth government. It was catalogued as CFS-7, effectively the 7th aircraft in what was to become the Royal Australian Air Force. There's a little interesting side story on that. In the war, the Australians quickly conquered the German colonies in northern New Guinea and the nearby islands. Then they set up another expedition to take German colonies further north, such as the Caroline Islands, in case the Germans might put up a fight. They took a couple of military aeroplanes, one of which was the Farman, making it the first aircraft to be sent out of Australia to fight. However, the British ordered that the expedition should be abandoned. The Japanese were being given the islands to encourage them to join the war. So the Farman was brought back to Point Cook in Victoria and used for training for a few years. And unfortunately, after 1917, it just sort of disappeared from view. It is recorded in a mural that is in the keeping of the Australian War Museum. Lebbeus himself went to war. Because he's such an important person, the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayoress gave him an elaborate send-off party. Olga and Lebbeus went to the United Kingdom in 1915. He said in the Telegraph newspaper that his plan was to buy his own plane and fight in the war. However, when he went to training, he was rejected for bad eyesight, and he got a commission in the artillery. In 1916, he was caught in a gas attack and also suffered from shell shock and spent some time in hospital recovering from this. They came back in early 1918 and immediately joined the social whirl. Lebbeus was welcomed with open arms and gave his opinion on the progress of the war and other things. After the war, Lebbeus was the chief founder of the aerial company. He put in probably most of the £30,000 capital, and he's the managing director. They bought a couple of DH-6s from war surplus and did a couple of flights around the state, but the plan was that Lebbeus would go to England and go shopping for some new aircraft. Lebbeus was keen on seaplanes. He liked the idea that you didn't have to have an airport for them. And he bought two Sir Curtis Seagull two-seater flying boats, one short shrimp seaplane capable of carrying a pilot and 3 passengers, and a big Felixstowe flying boat. We'll hear a lot about that later on. An early acquisition was a seaplane tender, specially made in Tasmania. The Acel was a very seaworthy boat, specially equipped to look after seaplanes, with a special feature of photographic darkroom and electrical generator, so that they could produce their own aerial photographs. The crew that Lebbeus chose was pretty good. On the right we have Andrew Lang, chief pilot. He's a very accomplished aviator, flew many types of aircraft and had a fascinating war record. He was from an upper-class family and was a journalist who wrote about seaplanes and cars under the pen name of Napier Lion. On the other side we have Charles Snook, again an experienced aviator and also a skilled seaman. He was the captain of the Acel. His task was to survey each landing spot for possible use as a permanent stopping place for the airline that Lebbeus hoped to develop. Alex Hill in the middle was a talented mechanic and photographer. The Curtis Seagull was an interesting aeroplane. It was made in the USA. Over 350 was built. It was a two-seater with good range, good speed for the time. It had an interesting history. One thing that it was famous for was being the first to be used by the United States in war when they were having a little border tiff with Mexico over the settlement of Santa Cruz in 1914. Lebbeus produced 2 Seagulls of the domestic version produced at the end of the war, registered as AUCV and AUCU. There are only 2 Seagulls left in the world. This one is in the Omaka Aviation Heritage Centre in Blenheim, New Zealand. The wooden craftsmanship of the fuselage is exquisite, but particularly in hot climates it just wasn't very durable. Here is the Seagull being set up at Elizabeth Bay. Lebbeus was keen to have a coastal survey conducted, the first such survey in Australia. So the aircraft left Sydney in mid-March, called at various stops down the coast, taking people for short flights and assessing landing sites and overnight shelter publicities. In Victoria, the Premier was even taken for a flight. When they reached Welshpool at the very south of Victoria, they flew to Tasmania via Flinders Island, landing at Launceston on the 20th of May. They had hoped to be able to fly back via Melbourne, but they were a bit worried about the condition of the machine, so they flew back directly. They had a very good trip, only occupying about 15 days with very few problems. A rough map of where they called. The whole thing was written up by Lang in the Sydney Mail. For many months they had at least a page or two in the doings of the seaplanes. Very Bickles-looking stuff. And you'd think you'd be able to get a good itinerary from that. However, Lang was a very discursive writer, not good on dates and times, but he took every opportunity to talk about people from his old school that he met, the wartime experiences of the crew, the local scenery, or anything else that he was interested in. There were certainly plenty of adventures. At Eden, a huge storm developed. An anchorage was exposed to the storm, so Lang rowed out in a dinghy to the Seagull and took off through the breaking waves. It was an almost unbelievable fleet. He usually took 2 people to start the engine, and he also had to slip the anchor by himself. The onlookers could hardly see the aircraft for the spray which went everywhere, but he took off and landed in a more sheltered spot. They had many perilous adventures in the whole trip. Here's the aircraft in Launceston on the Tamar River with the Azul in the background. They stayed there a week or 2. Throughout the journey, the papers were full of Lebbeus' scheme to have an airline based on the seaplanes. When the coastal survey of New South Wales was finished, Lang wrote a paean of praise to the Curtiss that he flew. And he asked that maybe one day it might find a place in some quiet museum, when in the ages to come she will be looked upon with awe and wonder by children. Unfortunately, not one of Lebbeus' seaplanes was preserved. This is Frank Hurley, the famous filmmaker and photographer. Before the war, he was involved in incredible Antarctic adventures, which established his fame. After the war, he took on many projects, one of which was an exploration of New Guinea, and for that Lebbeus lent him some aeroplanes. They first arrived in Port Moresby on the 17th of August 1922. The expedition worked its way along the coast to Kaimari and then on to Daru, where they hoped to be able to explore the Fly River by aircraft. But they had lots of problems because of such things as heat and extreme weather conditions, running aground, hitting floating objects in the water. So in the event when one of the Curtisses did reach Daru, it was in such bad shape that it would be very dangerous to carry out the plans to explore the river, which had a huge swampy delta. So they flew 200 kilometres to Thursday Island and got a ride back to Sydney on the trading ship which regularly visited the island. So let's have a look at some of the pictures from New Guinea. Here we see one of the Curtisses unloaded at Hanoabada, a suburb of Port Moresby, which is still famous for its houses on stilts. The short shrimp was also taken to New Guinea. The expedition hoped that the shrimp would be very successful. It was a rugged-looking biplane with a big cockpit in the front for 4 people, a smaller cockpit behind for the pilot, and a reliable Beardmore engine. There's a very good series of pictures and a film sequence about the short being unloaded. Incidentally, Lang and Hill and Snook got into trouble with the local colonial masters, the Europeans who dominated the place, for actually working. They said, you shouldn't be unloading the aeroplanes. That work should be done by the natives, and you're spoiling the way that we do things here. Well, Hurley and Snook were determined to do the unloading as they were worried about the aircraft being damaged. This particular fellow on the dinghy here is described by Hurley as being a huge help. He was a diver and a wonderful swimmer and spoke English. There's a general view of the unloading. This is where the shrimp was moored in Hanoabada. The natives were very excited about it, and possibly at the direction of Hurley, they paddled around it in circles. Hurley said that the natives thought that the aeroplane was direct for the gods because they had no understanding of how things worked in the modern world. Another picture of Hanoraba, and another picture of the natives adoring the short shrimp. And here we are at Daru. Again, the natives in the stand-up paddle boats were very excited. One scene was very interesting, was where the natives presented the aircraft with a pig. Hurley claimed it was because the aircraft was regarded as a god. Another picture of interest is this young fellow who'd made a model. Another example of a cargo cult. The idea was that the natives didn't understand what was happening, and they thought that if they made an aeroplane, they might be able to fly themselves. If they built a wharf, then maybe a steamer would appear in it. These huge communal houses at Daru are very interesting and part of Hurley's expensive photo record of the people and customs. The expedition collected a lot of artefacts, and Hurley got into trouble with the Australian government because they said he paid too little for them. He said he paid twice as much as the natives asked. Hurley's relationship with the authorities was often difficult. But when they got back, Hurley was a celebrity. His work and his donations were very popular with the Australian Museum. His film was called Pearls and Savages. Several versions of it were made for Australia and overseas use, particularly in America and also in Europe. But it wasn't a commercial success that Hurley was hoping for. He went back the following year, 1924, to finish the movie, but didn't take any aeroplanes. But no one can take from Lebbeus Hordern the credit for having the first aircraft in New Guinea. Only 2 aircraft visited New Guinea in the next 5 years, but after that, New Guinea 100 years ago became home to one of the most significant airlifts in history. But that's another story. Apart from the pictures of the unloading, the shrimp seldom appears in the narrative of Hurley's expedition, and I think it wasn't very successful at all. I think that probably the problem was that the aircraft, which would fly well in cold British climates, wouldn't perform well in high temperatures with thinner air. Anyway, they took the aeroplane back to Sydney, but on its first flight in Sydney, it crashed. The crew were very lucky to escape. They retrieved the aeroplane from 7 fathoms of water, but they didn't repair it, which indicates that maybe it was a complete failure for Australian conditions. But the Curtises were still flying okay, and Lebbeus had lost his enthusiasm for running an airline by 1923. So we have a new player. Horry Miller was one of a group of 4 young Australian aviation enthusiasts who went to England together in 1911. The group included Harry Hawker. He gave his name to Hawker Aviation Company in Britain, which of course produced the Hawker Hurricane, the principal aircraft in the Battle of Britain. All had significant careers in aviation. When Horry Miller returned from the war, he tried to start off an airline of his own called the Commercial Aviation Company, but he ran out of money and sold his aeroplanes to Qantas. And then he took over the 2 seaplanes from Lebbeus. I'll finish his story before I go on. This didn't work, as we'll see, but in 1928, Horry Miller joined the Robertson Miller Aviation Company. That became part of Airlines of Western Australia, and later of Ansett Airlines. Horry was an underrated pioneer of civil aviation in Australia. His idea when taking over the Seagulls was to have a seaplane taxi service based on Adelaide, serving Kangaroo Island and also being able to take people over to Port Lincoln, where there were mining interests, so there were people who could pay the money. And you can see how much time that would save, particularly over the roads that existed in the time. Driving around the shoreline was about 650 kilometres to Port Lincoln from Adelaide. But basically the idea of a seaplane airline didn't work. The big problem was that all the attention had to be given to the seaplanes to keep them safe. Tides were a huge problem. They had to be continually monitored to make sure that they weren't going to run around or float away. The slightest bad weather caused problems. The whole idea just didn't work. Here we've got Horry starting the engine with a crank to enable the pilot to take the lady for a joy flight. He took the aircraft to Brisbane and carried on giving joy flights there. AUCV was eventually written off after a crash on the banks of the Brisbane River at New Farm, but we don't know the fate of AUCU. Sad, but worse was to come. The Felixstowe, as you can see, is by far the biggest aircraft in the fleet. It cost £15,500 and a lot depended on it being successful. About 275 large flying boats were made at the Norfolk town of Felixstowe during the war. They were quite formidable military aircraft for their time, carrying a bomb load of about 500 pounds. They patrolled the North Sea, hunting German submarines. At the end of the war, 3 Felixstowe F-3s were modified as passenger aircraft. Lebbeus purchased GE EAQT for £5,000. It was beautifully set up inside with 3 lounges carrying 11 people in perfect comfort. The idea was that they'd fly coastal services and to New Guinea, New Zealand, and eventually to Singapore. The Felixstowe arrived in 1920 and was taken to the aerial company's hangar at Botany Bay. But to everyone's distress, it was found to be damaged in transit, and it was actually never assembled in Australia. Still, it was a very impressive aircraft, and in July 1923, Charles Kingsford Smith and Keith Anderson were looking for an aeroplane to fly the Pacific. So Lebbeus showed them the Felixstowe, but they are not interested in buying it. Late in 1925, Lebbeus again offered the Felixstowe to Kingsford Smith for the token price of £1,000. The famous aircraft engineer Lawrence Wackett inspected it and estimated that it cost a huge amount for repairs, and in any case, the range could not be extended to even 1,600 kilometres, so it couldn't cross the Pacific, and the offer was rejected. It was stored in the hangar for quite a while, and then it was sold, and the fuselage was used as a houseboat. Seen here in November 1926, it was sold for a few pounds and was destroyed by fire shortly thereafter. So this was a huge blow to Lebbeus, and indeed the final blow to his ambitions of running an airline. But worse was to come for Lebbeus as his personal life disintegrated. Since 1920, his wife Olga had usually lived in Europe and had custody of their son Lebbeus Jr. Olga received an allowance of £10,000 a year, which was about equivalent to about $1 million these days. But in 1924, there was a disagreement about how the money was being paid. And as you do in these cases, each person hired a team of eminent lawyers, and they started arguing over what should happen. A divorce action began, and Olga left for Europe with the son and let the court case proceed without her. And then, suddenly on the 24th of May 1924, Lebbeus left for Hong Kong. And on the 27th of May, evidence showed that early in 1918, Lebbeus had had an affair with one Evelyn Honoria Brown, whose occupation was listed as shop assistant in hotels throughout London and elsewhere. On September the 11th, a baby was born, registered by her mother as Barbara Lebbeus Hordern. And Lebbeus had then made an allowance to the mother and child of £1,000 a year. And of course, the story was backed up with letters and other documentary evidence, all of which were published in detail and with salacious delight throughout the media. A divorce was granted, and in February 1926, on the day that the decree became absolute, Lebbeus married Frances May Barry at the Adelaide Registry Office. She is an attractive 27-year-old from a family of legal professionals. They travelled to Sydney by car in a honeymoon, and again Mr. and Mrs. Lebbeus Hordern began to figure in the social pages. Not to the same extent as with the previous marriage, but there's still a lot of interest in what was happening. Apart from taking a more limited place in society, Lebbeus took a bit of interest in aircraft. He quite often offered a prize, as you can see, for various aeronautical feats. In 1924, he made his last venture into buying an aircraft. He said he wanted to go fishing on Botany Bay and asked Short Brothers in England to design him a suitable flying boat. This was an all-metal aircraft. I think he'd had enough of wooden aircraft. But the problem was it was completely underpowered. It had two tiny little 30 horsepower Cherub engines, so Lebbeus didn't take delivery of it. But the Short cockle, as it was called, was used by Shorts for about another year, and certainly its main benefit was in giving Shorts experience with all-metal aircraft. Lebbeus was becoming withdrawn, depressed, and introspective, and on the 18th of November 1926, this amazing article appeared in The Sun. It was by Lebbeus, and the fact that it appeared in The Sun was interesting because The Sun wasn't a very intellectual newspaper. But he talked about honour and glory and implicitly the value of his life and work. It's a very hard article to decipher, but as a brief summary, he said that achieving popularity and fame wasn't important. What was important is living a life where he did something to ameliorate, and he quote, human vigour, wisdom and process, close quote. In 1928, in June, Kingsford Smith succeeded in flying the Pacific. And that was absolutely an enormous news. Watch out for 2028 and see if this magnificent achievement is properly recognised. Lebbeus hadn't supported the original flight, but he did give the successful airman a cheque for $5,000, which was by far the biggest such donation. Interestingly, he didn't attend the function where the cheque was presented, and he was not the social being that he had previously been. Then, within a few months, he is found dead in bed. He died from an overdose of sedatives, a methamphetamine, better known in those days as phenobarb or phenobarbital. The coroner found he had died from an overdose of the drug, but he couldn't determine whether it was deliberate or accidental. Lebbeus was only 37 years old. The Truth, as usual, had a few words to say. But otherwise he had a good press in terms of obituaries. The Herald mentions a large number of mourners from all sections of the community, as well as a who's who of parliamentarians, the judiciary, and leaders of civic organisations. There were carloads of floral tributes. Most obituaries recorded his work as an aviation pioneer, and 5 aircraft flew in formation over his funeral. 1 dropped a wreath on his grave. But then problems emerged. It was thought that his estate would be at least £700,000. But it was found that it was only about £200,000, and Olga took legal action to secure her annuity. This legal action dragged on for several years. A minor complication was Miss Maud Chivers, formerly Lebbeus's private secretary, who claimed £1,000 from the estate, saying that it was for work done and that he had promised to marry her as soon as possible and provide for her if he died before this could happen. Incidentally, during 1927, the newspapers had slyly noticed that Frances was spending most of her time in Melbourne. In the end, Olga agreed to accept £120,000 as a lump sum rather than £10,000 a year. So that enabled Francis to get a good legacy also. It's interesting that Olga had more publicity than Francis, and she's mentioned several times in the Australian press, even during the 1950s when she lived overseas. There was a happy end to all this drama. Young Lebbeus inherited money from his family trust and became very wealthy. He gained an arts degree from Oxford and then a high-level engineering qualification and joined the Fleet Air Arm. He rose through the ranks from sub-lieutenant to at least the equivalent of squadron leader. And in this Fleet Air Arm publicity picture, you can see him briefing his squadron. On 3rd of April 1944, he led his squadron of Grumman Wildcat fighters when Fairey Barracuda aircraft attacked the German battleship Turpus. And Lebbeus was awarded a DSC for bravery. He seems to have had a very successful life. I think that his father would have been a little bit envious, but very proud. Thank you for listening.